Physics does not care about your bank account. Gravity cannot be bribed, and wind resistance does not negotiate with arrogant billionaires. I am a lead structural engineer. For the past 12 years, my signature has been the only thing standing between an 80-story skyscraper and a catastrophic collapse. I calculate load-bearing capacities, stress fractures, and material fatigue. My job is to ensure that when a hurricane hits a coastal city, the people drinking coffee in their penthouses don't even feel the building sway. My firm was hired to design the structural skeleton for the Apex Tower. It was supposed to be the crown jewel of the city skyline, an $800 million residential high-rise funded by a notorious real estate developer named Richard. Richard was the kind of man who wore custom Italian suits to active construction sites and screamed at contractors for getting dust on his shoes. He viewed city zoning laws as mild suggestions and treated his engineering team like an annoying expense. The Apex Tower was an incredibly complex build. It was an 80-story spire made almost entirely of glass, situated on a narrow plot of land near the financial district. To keep the building from snapping like a twig in high winds, the core required a highly specific, ultra-dense grade of reinforced concrete and a custom alloy of structural steel for the primary support columns. I spent 6 months calculating the exact specifications. The margins of error were practically zero. Every single beam had to be perfect, or the entire structure would be inherently unstable. For the first 20 floors, everything went exactly according to the blueprints. I personally inspected the steel shipments and signed off on the concrete pours. But Richard was hemorrhaging money. He had overpromised luxury amenities to his foreign investors, and the project was $30 million over budget. Instead of cutting back on the gold-plated elevator fixtures or the imported Italian marble in the lobby, Richard decided to secretly cut costs where he thought nobody would notice: the bones of the building. I found out on a rainy Tuesday during a routine site audit on the 25th floor. I was reviewing the latest delivery manifests from our steel supplier, and the serial numbers didn't match my master ledger. I went down to the staging area and tested a core sample of the new support beams. They weren't the custom, high-tensile alloy I had mandated. They were a cheap, standard-grade commercial iron mix. It was the kind of metal you use to build a suburban shopping mall, not an 80-story glass needle. I immediately checked the concrete manifests. The ultra-dense mix for the elevator core had been secretly swapped out for a cheaper, faster-curing commercial grade. Richard was purposely sabotaging his own building to pocket a $30 million difference. I didn't schedule a meeting. I walked straight into Richard's temporary field office at the base of the construction site. He was sitting behind a massive oak desk, yelling at someone on his phone, wearing a pristine white hard hat that had never seen a speck of dust. I dropped the metallurgical lab results and the concrete core data directly onto his keyboard. I told him, in no uncertain terms, that the materials being used from the 21st floor upward were structurally compromised. I explained that if we continued building with this cheap iron and low-density concrete, the tower would inevitably suffer catastrophic shear failure in a high-wind event. Richard slowly hung up the phone. He didn't look surprised, and he certainly didn't look guilty. He just looked annoyed. He leaned back in his chair and gave me a condescending smile. He told me that I was a brilliant mathematician, but I fundamentally lacked an understanding of real estate economics. He claimed the new materials were well within acceptable commercial tolerances, and that my original specifications were wildly over-engineered. He ordered me to go back to my desk, approve the manifests, and sign the safety compliance form so they could pour the next floor. I refused. I told him that my engineering license and my personal integrity were not for sale, and I would absolutely not sign off on a death trap just so he could finance his third yacht. Richard's smile vanished. His face turned a dangerous shade of red. He stood up, leaned over the desk, and pointed a manicured finger at my face. He told me that he owned the city zoning board, he owned the building inspectors, and he could have my engineering license permanently revoked by making one phone call. He officially fired me on the spot for insubordination. He ordered me to leave the blueprints on the desk, pack up my personal belongings, and get off his property immediately. He sneered and said he would just hire a compliant engineer who actually understood how the real world worked. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten to go to the local news. I simply left the documents on his desk, turned around, and walked out of the office. He thought he had completely crushed me. He thought his money and influence had bought my silence. He didn't realize that by forcibly removing the lead structural engineer from an active high-risk site, he had just triggered a very obscure, very powerful legal mechanism. There is a federal mandate in commercial high-rise construction that most developers intentionally ignore because it is almost never utilized. It is called a transfer of risk protocol. When a lead structural engineer is involuntarily removed from a Tier 1 building project, they are legally permitted a grace period of 180 days to file a comprehensive safety and risk liability report with the Federal Building Commission. It is a fail-safe designed to prevent corrupt developers from quietly replacing honest engineers to hide critical structural flaws. If I had gone to the press or the local city inspectors immediately, Richard would have just bribed them or buried me in defamation lawsuits. He would have paid a minor fine, replaced the iron on the 25th floor, and continued building. That wasn't good enough. I didn't want him to pay a fine. I wanted to completely dismantle his empire. So I went home, updated my resume, and did absolutely nothing. I let Richard build. For the next 5.5 months, I watched from my apartment window as the Apex Tower climbed higher and higher into the city skyline. Richard's new compliant engineer signed off on every single delivery of cheap iron and low-grade concrete. They poured millions of dollars into the construction every week. They installed the imported Italian marble, the custom glass panels, and the luxury gold-plated elevators. Richard threw lavish parties for his foreign investors, boasting about how fast the construction was moving and how much money they were saving. He sold over 60% of the penthouses off-plan to Hollywood actors and tech billionaires. I meticulously tracked their progress using public construction logs and drone footage. By the end of the 5th month, the tower had reached 60 stories. Thousands of tons of cheap, brittle materials had been permanently cemented into the city's skyline, bearing the crushing weight of everything above it. The trap was fully loaded. On day 179 of my legal grace period, I walked into the regional office of the Federal Building Commission. I didn't bring a lawyer. I just brought a heavy briefcase. I walked up to the chief inspector's desk and pulled a 400-page bound document from my briefcase. It was the official Transfer of Risk and Liability Report. It contained every single structural calculation, every original metallurgical lab result, and every concrete density test from my time on the Apex Tower project. I had meticulously documented the exact moment Richard ordered the material swap, cross-referenced with delivery manifests and the rubber-stamped approvals of the compliant engineer who replaced me. The chief inspector looked annoyed at first, assuming it was just a petty grievance from a disgruntled former employee. But then he opened the binder. He was an engineer himself. It only took him 10 minutes of reviewing my shear stress equations to realize he was looking at the mathematical blueprints for a mass casualty event. When physics dictates that a skyscraper is going to fall, federal agencies do not schedule polite meetings. They act with terrifying speed. Within 4 hours of filing my report, the Federal Building Commission bypassed the corrupt local city inspectors entirely. They issued an emergency, immediate effect stop work order. I parked my car a few blocks away in the financial district just to watch it happen. 3 black federal government vehicles pulled directly onto the active construction site, completely ignoring Richard's private security guards. Federal agents and independent structural auditors swarmed the ground floor. Sirens blared across the site as the massive tower cranes were forcefully powered down and locked into place. Concrete mixer trucks were ordered to halt their drums and immediately leave the premises. I could see Richard sprinting out of his pristine field office, his face purple with rage, screaming at the federal agents, waving his phone, and threatening to sue the United States government. The agents didn't even acknowledge his existence. They just slapped a massive red condemnation notice directly across the glass doors of his luxury marketing suite. Over the next 48 hours, an independent federal engineering firm moved in with ultrasonic testing equipment and industrial X-ray machines. They scanned the steel columns on the 25th floor and took sonic core samples of the elevator shafts. They didn't need to guess, and they couldn't be bribed. The machines verified my original math with absolute terrifying precision. The official federal audit concluded that the 60-story structure currently standing in the center of the financial district had the structural integrity of a wet glass bottle. The report explicitly stated that if a severe winter storm or a Category 2 hurricane hit the city, the apex tower would snap near the 30th floor and collapse directly onto the heavily populated surrounding city blocks. Richard's world started collapsing faster than his building ever could. His initial reaction was to throw money at the problem, just like he had done his entire life. He hired a small army of expensive corporate lawyers and crisis management teams to flood the news networks with his narrative. He desperately offered to retrofit the tower, proposing the installation of massive external steel braces or carbon fiber wraps around the compromised central core. He even offered to cap the final height of the building, stopping construction right there at 60 stories instead of the planned 80. But you cannot negotiate with structural mechanics. The federal engineers looked at his expensive, desperate proposals and practically laughed. To fix the brittle iron and low-grade concrete starting on the 21st floor, you would have to temporarily lift 39 stories of glass, steel, and marble into the thin air, pull out the bad bones, and slide new ones in. It was a physical impossibility. The building was a terminal patient. Once the unredacted federal safety report was made available to the public, the financial bloodbath began. The Hollywood actors, tech executives, and foreign investors who had pre-purchased the luxury penthouses immediately filed massive class action lawsuits against Richard for fraud, demanding their deposits back with interest. The major banks that had extended him hundreds of millions of dollars in high-interest construction loans panicked. They immediately called in his debts, freezing his corporate accounts, seizing his personal assets, and placing liens on his other properties to cover their immense losses. The compliant, rubber-stamping engineer he had hired to replace me didn't fare much better. He was arrested by federal agents at an airport terminal trying to leave the country, indicted for criminal negligence and wire fraud. Richard went on local television, sweating profusely through his custom Italian suit, claiming it was a massive conspiracy orchestrated by a jealous, disgruntled former employee. But the public didn't care about his excuses. They only cared about the fact that a 60-story guillotine was currently hanging over their heads in the middle of downtown. The final absolute blow came 3 weeks later from the city Supreme Court. The judge ruled that the Apex Tower was a clear and present danger to public safety and an active threat to the surrounding infrastructure. Because the site was situated in a highly dense, populated urban environment, the city couldn't just leave it abandoned as a decaying monument to his greed. The court issued an unprecedented and devastating legal mandate. Richard's development company was ordered to completely demolish the 60-story structure. Furthermore, because of the proximity to other inhabited buildings, they were strictly forbidden from using conventional explosives to bring it down. They had to deconstruct it methodically, piece by piece, floor by floor, in reverse order. And the judge ruled that Richard was legally obligated to pay for the entire demolition process out of his own pocket. Deconstructing a 60-story glass and steel skyscraper piece by piece in the middle of a crowded financial district is mathematically more complex and significantly more expensive than building it in the first place. Richard didn't just lose his initial $800 million investment. The court-ordered deconstruction was estimated to cost an additional $150 million in specialized labor, hazard insurance, and logistical planning. His massive real estate empire immediately filed for corporate bankruptcy, but that didn't save him. Because the federal government easily proved criminal negligence and intentional fraud, the courts pierced his corporate veil. They authorized the immediate liquidation of his personal assets to fund the demolition. The private jets, the mega yachts, the sprawling coastal mansions, and the fleet of imported sports cars were entirely seized and auctioned off by the government. He went from being a celebrated billionaire on the cover of financial magazines to a completely broke man facing over a decade in federal prison for reckless endangerment. But the most deeply satisfying part of the entire ordeal wasn't watching Richard get dragged into a federal courthouse wearing handcuffs instead of a custom Italian suit. The city had a massive problem on its hands. They desperately needed an independent structural expert to oversee the highly dangerous deconstruction process. They needed an engineer who intimately understood the original blueprints of the Apex Tower, the exact stress points of the compromised materials, and the safest way to dismantle a fragile glass needle without crushing the city blocks below. The Federal Engineering Commission approached my consulting firm. I told them I would be happy to accept the position as the lead demolition supervisor, but I had a few conditions. I demanded double my original salary, full federal hazard pay, and absolute unquestioned autonomy over the entire construction site. They didn't even try to negotiate. They signed my contract the very next morning. For the next year and a half, I was paid an exorbitant amount of taxpayer money to systematically tear down the ultimate monument to Richard's arrogance. Every single day, I stood on the ground with my pristine white hard hat, drinking my coffee, and watching the massive tower cranes lower pieces of his gold-plated elevators and shattered luxury glass to the street below. Every time a steel beam was unbolted and hauled away to the scrapyard, I knew Richard was sitting in a federal holding cell, completely powerless to stop it. He tried to build a legacy by ignoring the fundamental laws of physics and treating his lead engineer like a disposable tool. In the end, physics won, and the woman he forcibly threw off his property was the one getting paid a fortune to bury his empire. Thank you for watching this full Reddit nuclear revenge story. If you loved hearing how a fired engineer legally forced a corrupt billionaire to demolish his own skyscraper, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever seen an arrogant boss's ego completely destroy their own business? Let me know your best stories in the comments down below. Until next time, stay smart, stay quiet, and always trust the math.